All right, so tonight we are diving headfirst into local politics, folks. We're heading to Springfield, Ohio. Specifically, the City Commission meeting, minutes from, let's see, July 16th, 2024. And, well, let's just say this wasn't your average, rubber stamp kind of meeting.
Not even close. Just the sheer volume of public comments. It's clear this one hit a nerve.
Oh, yeah, 20-plus people at the mic. That's a whole lot of passionate Springfield's residents. And you know what's interesting? A good chunk of them were focused on one really big issue.
Immigration. It was a thread throughout the entire meeting, really, with residents bringing up a whole range of concerns. Impact on city resources, questions about crime, you name it.
Absolutely. And they did not hold back on sharing their experiences. Like, take Miss Glenda Bailey, for instance. She actually felt that the commission's previous presentation on immigration lacked, hard data. She wanted specifics, especially on the strain on healthcare and other resources.
Right. That desire for, concrete information seemed to be a recurring theme. It's like, with an issue as complex as immigration, they crave those solid facts and figures to really get a handle on things.
Makes sense, right. And I think you see that in how some folks approach it. Like, we've got Mr. Richard Jordan, for example. He expressed concern about resources being diverted away from longtime Springfield residents, specifically mentioned veterans and the homeless population.
Which, speaks to another layer of this whole thing, doesn't it? The whole idea of shifting demographics and how communities adapt to those changes. Especially when resources are limited, things can get, complicated.
For sure. And then, on the flip side, you've got voices like Ms. Nancy Flinchbaugh. She brought up Springfield's history with immigrant populations, really highlighting, the contributions of Latino residents.
Right. It's a good reminder that these conversations don't exist in a bubble. There's always this undercurrent of existing dynamics within a community, its history, its identity.
Yeah, and sometimes those conversations can get a little, shall we say, heated. But there was this one request from Miss Kelly Lawrence that I thought was really interesting. She called for the city to bring in an expert from the Department of Jobs and Family Services for a dedicated work session on the issue.
Sure.
Her goal, she said, was to clear up what she sees as misinformation about the support that immigrants receive.
Interesting. It suggests that beyond just, strongly held beliefs, there's this real desire for transparency from the city's leadership, this need to ground the conversation in facts.
Yes. And speaking of facts, there was this other thread running through the public comments, and this one felt incredibly, immediate. It felt very real for these residents.
You're talking about the safety concerns.
Exactly. And this wasn't theoretical. You could hear the urgency, the frustration in people's voices.
Definitely.
We had Mr. Bruce Clay, for instance, talking about four-wheelers tearing up public property, and then he brought up the issue of code enforcement and how they can't seem to handle squatters. And then, Mr. Robert Skinner, he shared a story about teenagers causing property damage. He'd reported it weeks ago, but it was like crickets, nothing.
And it's that feeling of being ignored, right? That really came through.
Imagine being a resident and feeling like your concerns they just don't matter. Like, nobody's listening.
It's that lack of accountability that can be so frustrating for folks.
For sure. And it's interesting. You've got residents feeling ignored on one hand, and then on the other, there's this whole other layer of, let's just say it, the city commission's appearance on Fox News.
Yes. That definitely sparked some reactions.
It did. We had Ms. Darla Sanders, for instance. She pointed out that she'd been raising these same concerns about safety and fairness directly to the commission for weeks, but, they chose to go on a national news platform instead of addressing their constituents directly.
Yeah, it really highlights the power of media, doesn't it? And that potential disconnect between how officials choose to communicate versus, actually addressing those concerns at a local level.
Especially because, and this is where it gets interesting, it seems like some of the commissioners themselves were caught off guard by this whole Fox News thing.
Oh, that's right. Commissioner Brown specifically stated that she, and it seems some of her fellow commissioners, had no prior knowledge of the appearance. And she even questioned the choice of platform, calling it and I'm quoting here, partisan news station, and emphasized the need for the city to control its own narrative.
Okay, so we've got residents feeling unheard, commissioners potentially being, blindsided by their colleagues. Suddenly, this seemingly straightforward meeting is starting to feel like the pilot episode, like a political drama, wouldn't you say?
Well, it certainly has all the elements, doesn't it?
It does. And speaking of drama, that takes us right into the very first item on the agenda for this meeting, which was, wait for it, a closed-door executive session. And that political drama takes us right into the very first item on the agenda for this meeting, which was, wait for it, a closed-door executive session.
Yeah, you know those closed-door sessions, they always sound kind of, I don't know, a little secretive.
Right. Like, what goes on in those things? Are they making backroom deals or something?
Probably not quite that dramatic. It's more, they're legally allowed to have these private discussions about stuff that, for whatever reason, can't be publicly disclosed.
So all the really juicy stuff.
Well, juicy might be a stretch. Usually we're talking about, like, personnel issues, so employee discipline, contract negotiations, that sort of thing.
Ah, so potential lawsuits. I'm guessing those minutes are sealed up tight.
Pretty much, yeah. The minutes themselves are super bare bones. It's basically like, who is their mention of personnel and pending litigation, and that's it.
Classic.
Yeah.
So more questions than answers, as usual. But it's hard not to play connect the dots here, right?
Yeah.
Especially with all those public comments we talked about. Like, were they discussing maybe disciplinary action related to those code enforcement complaints, the ones Mr. Clay brought up?
Could be. Or maybe they were trying to get ahead of a potential lawsuit over how the city's handling, those property damage reports that Mr. Skinner mentioned.
Ooh, that's a good point. And what about the whole Fox News thing? Do you think that sparked some closed-door debate, maybe even some disagreement about how the city commission presents itself as a united front?
It's definitely possible. I mean, think about it. We're getting this, like, behind-the-scenes peek at what goes on in these meetings, the inner workings, the potential conflicts, the tensions, all those things that often drive these decisions.
Totally. And it makes you wonder, I mean, does all this drama actually turn into, action? Meetings are one thing, but what about concrete decisions? What do they actually do?
Right, because at the end of the day, residents want to see results. They want action. And that's where the rest of this meeting gets really interesting, because even with all the passionate pleas, the closed-door discussions, the city commission still had to, like, actually get down to business, right? Voting on those ordinances, those resolutions, and, of course, how to spend all those taxpayer dollars.
All right, so let's talk money. What did they actually put on the chopping block?
Okay.
All right, so let's talk money. What did they actually put on the chopping block?
Oh, one thing that stood out to me was funding for, like, a bunch of different stuff, actually. Grants for public transit, improvements, and there's this new program for the drug court. Oh, and remember all those electric car fires we've been hearing about?
Yeah, scary stuff.
Right. So they're putting some money towards those fire blankets. Apparently, they're super important for those types of fires.
Interesting. It's like they're really trying to stay on top of, like, these very current events.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just the headline-grabbing issues either. They also approved this grant for police training from the Ohio Attorney General's office.
Which, thinking back to those public comments, that feels very timely, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. And this particular grant focuses on, like, tactical threat training for Springfield officers.
Wow. That's, talk about direct action related to those concerns, huh? Okay, so we've got public safety, infrastructure, what else? What about that golf course thing? Did anything happen with that?
There was. Remember how the city was thinking about a new lease for, what was it called, Reed Park Golf Course?
Yeah, with the option to buy later on, right?
Yeah.
That seemed like kind of a big deal for, like, local recreation and all that.
Totally. And it sounds like they're moving forward with it because the commission actually approved the lease agreement at this meeting. And it still includes that option to buy the golf course down the road, too.
Wow. So, yeah, like you said, big potential changes coming to how folks in Springfield spend their weekends.
Yeah.
I'll be curious to see how that all plays out. But, okay, on a more, like, practical level, what's the deal with the sidewalk situation? $1 million for sidewalks.
Right. Which is, like, we don't think about them much, but we rely on good sidewalks every day.
Every day.
So the city is issuing over $1 million in bonds specifically for sidewalks. Curb and gutter improvements, too. So it's a big investment in basic infrastructure.
Okay, but how does that work? Like, for the average homeowner, what does that mean? Is that coming out of my property taxes?
It very well could be. So when they make these improvements on your street, usually a portion of that cost gets, like, tacked onto your property taxes. You can often pay it off over time, but still. Important to remember those sidewalk upgrades aren't, free.
See, this is why we deep dive. You would never think a sidewalk came with so much financial intrigue.
Right. Oh, and speaking of intrigue, there was one more little nugget tucked away in these minutes. They're talking about potentially revamping Springfield's minority business program.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that has huge implications for, you know, local businesses, the economy. What can you tell us?
Not a ton, unfortunately. The minutes just say they introduced an ordinance, but no real details yet on what exactly they're proposing. But given all the public comments about, fairness, representation, this feels like something that could directly impact all of that.
It's like this whole web of like interconnected issues and decisions. Pretty fascinating, right?
Totally. And I think that's got to be the biggest takeaway from all of this. We often think about local government as this, like, dry, bureaucratic thing. But when you really dig into it, you see the human side of it all, the hopes, the anxieties, all the ways these decisions play out in people's lives.
Exactly. And we see those hopes, those anxieties playing out on like
Yeah.
multiple levels here, right?
Yeah.
Residents demanding action and accountability, maybe feeling like those in charge aren't listening. And then on the other side, you got those officials potentially disagreeing with each other behind the scenes. They try to navigate these really complex issues
Yeah.
all out in the open.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so compelling. It's not static. This meeting, it was just a snapshot. So the real question is, what happens next? Will we see some actual transparency from the city? Will they actually change those minority business programs? And how will residents respond?
So many questions. Like, we've just finished a really good book, but instead of a nice, neat ending, we're left with, well, the reality of local politics, which is messy and constantly evolving.
And that's the beauty of it. It's up to all of us to keep paying attention, to keep asking the tough questions, and to see how this whole thing unfolds.